Hi there, this is Professor Ewing again. I hope you're doing well, and I will try to briefly go through the slides on Christianity in the PowerPoint areas. If you are following along with me, you can simply go to the course menu, touch on PowerPoints, and open up the PowerPoint on Christianity. You should see a couple of images of Jesus of Nazareth, and I will go through the slides, hopefully not more than about a half an hour or so on this, and give you some background, some historical background to Jesus of Nazareth, obviously the focal figure in Christianity, and talk a little bit about the early beginnings of that tradition. I have a second PowerPoint that's simply entitled Christianity After Jesus, and that deals really with the formation of the apostolic community, the early Christian community, after the time of the historical Jesus. So let's go ahead and get started. The first slide we're looking at, the title page, has two images. You'll notice the one on your left is a still from a film. A very influential movie was made for TV. It was a TV miniseries in the 1970s, late 70s, 1978 to be specific. I remember watching this with my family, and it was on a series of nights over the course of probably Easter week or Holy Week in 1978. It was very famous for its time. It was from a Catholic perspective. The director was Italian Roman Catholic in background, and the one of the people who collaborated on the screenplay based on the four canonical Christian Gospels was an English Catholic, and his name was Anthony Burgess. He's famous also for other novels. Surprisingly, the novel called Clockwork Orange, or A Clockwork Orange, and he was a British Catholic and was asked to help collaborate on the screenplay for the film called Jesus of Nazareth. A couple of things in the late 70s, a lot of the film versions of the stories of Jesus, etc., previous to that time, were very Anglo in their orientation, British, and so Jesus comes off as being sort of an Elizabethan actor, sort of Shakespearean. There were pluses and minuses to this miniseries. One plus, obviously, with a miniseries is you can do a lot more with it. You're not limited by the time frame of one single movie, 2.5 hours, let's say. Couple hours to 3 hours, maybe tops. With a mini series, this one is close to 6 hours long, so they could do more and cover more of the teachings and the miracles, etc., life of Jesus. They do have a very vivid crucifixion at the end of this film, and then a resurrection appearance. It's very dramatic. But the director and the producers, they wanted it to have an authentic feel, and at the time they filmed on location in Morocco in North Africa, and there are places in North Africa that looked more Mediterranean, more like Judea 2,000 years ago at the time of Jesus. And so I think they did a pretty good job with that, giving you the feel of what it would be like to live as a fisherman on the Sea of Galilee in one of the towns in the northern Galilee region, north of Jerusalem, where many of Jesus's disciples were from, and he's said to be from the village of Nazareth, sort of the sticks per se. country bumpkin. And then he comes to Capernaum and some of the other towns on the Sea of Galilee and draws his first disciples from there. Excuse me. Robert Powell is the actor, the British actor who's portraying the title role here. He does a convincing job. He's British, and you can see his skin is very fair. He does a great job of portraying Jesus of Nazareth, at least the version that we have in the 4 canonical Christian Gospels. Some very vivid points in the film, if you ever get a chance to look at the film or even excerpts. Usually in class, I like to show about 20 to 30 minutes of excerpts from this film, including John the Baptist baptizing Jesus of Nazareth in the Jordan River. That's a very moving sequence. And John the Baptist is saying various things and calling Jesus by various messianic titles. John was perceived as a prophet by the people, and he runs afoul of King Herod and the local authorities because he criticizes the fact that they're not following the law of Moses. So he was a very strong figure, and he's portrayed as such in the film. I'm struggling with some pollen and some allergies this time of year, so from time to time I might take a sip of water. And John baptizes Jesus in the River Jordan, and in a sense they corroborate or they validate, let's say, each other according to the gospel narratives. John is validated by Jesus because Jesus accepts baptism from him, so thereby recognizing that he's a true prophet of God and that his baptism is ordained from heaven, so to speak. John validates Jesus and uses various messianic titles drawn from the book of Psalms and from some of the prophets in the Hebrew Bible, book of Isaiah, Malachi, etc. And this validates, at least from the Gospels perspectives, this validates the fact that Jesus is truly the Christ or the Messiah. Christ is a Greek word, which is a translation of the Aramaic or the Hebrew Mashiach, which is, it means simply anointed one or anointed king of Israel. Jesus uniquely is not the only Messiah in the Bible. All of the Israelite kings, King David, King Solomon, his son who built the temple, the first temple in Jerusalem, all of those figures are referred to as Christs in a sense, Mashiach, because they're anointed by God, by Yahweh Elohim, to serve as the ruler of their people. And so there was a lot of this messianic, not only recitation of prophecies from the former books and authors, but a lot of messianic language that was used, not just by Christians, I might add, in the first century, but we find evidence of this in the Dead Sea Scrolls. The community out at Qumran, they were definitely seeking a messianic figure who would come and wipe away the corruption in the temple in Jerusalem and be a harbinger of the judgment of God, the final judgment, the end of days, so to speak. So Jesus' followers identify him as the Christ in the Gospels, and hence the term Christianity, right? Taking the term Christ and being, in essence, the teachings of the life and the sacrificial death as it's interpreted in Christianity, and the resurrection, the victory over death of Jesus. And hence Christians are little Christs, also anointed by the Holy Spirit in their baptism, and thus participating in the anointing of Jesus when he's baptized by John and the Holy Spirit descends on him. And in essence, this is his public outcoming, his manifestation as the Christ or the Messiah, the anointed King of Israel. If you look on your right hand, I have a picture of one of the oldest pictorial representations of Jesus. It's a wooden panel icon in the Greek Orthodox tradition, or the Eastern Orthodox Christian tradition generally. This is one of the earliest that survive. It's dated to about the 500s CE, which is significant, just artistically speaking, that this has survived from 1500 years ago. In the first couple of centuries of Christianity, there weren't what we would call detailed pictorial representations of Jesus. There were some reasons for that, but you do find representations of him that are more symbolic in character in the Roman catacombs and in some of the areas in the Near East, etc. They start showing up around late 2nd century and into the middle of the 3rd century CE. And they're mostly symbolic. You might sometimes see a shepherd carrying a sheep on his shoulders, and this is Jesus as in his role as the good shepherd, caring for the sheep and literally carrying a sheep on his shoulders. The iconography in the church doesn't really take on more of a representational form until about the 4th century, and then in later centuries there are debates in some of the ecumenical church councils as to which icons are appropriate for churches and personal devotional worship inside the home, etc. And certain of the early, more symbolic depictions of Jesus are sort of proscribed or ruled out, and what ends up happening, especially in Eastern Christianity, but also in the Western churches, you start to see more of a pictorial representation of Jesus. And you can see symbolically here we have some important elements. With his right hand, Jesus is blessing. He's offering a blessing as the high priest, the one who offers himself on behalf of his people. And then in his left hand, he's holding what appears to be a Bible. It's actually a portion of the Bible. It's the gospel book, the 4 canonical gospels. This is a bit of an artistic anachronism. It doesn't fit chronologically. I usually talk about this in class. Remember that in religious iconography, we're dealing with symbols, symbolic truth, which is more important and more influential, religiously speaking, than historical truth even. Although it's not meant to negate history. It's just that historically speaking, we know that that the Gospels weren't written, obviously, until decades after the time of the historical Jesus. And so literally he wouldn't be walking around Palestine carrying a book and say, oh, I wonder what I said here and wonder what I said here. Books weren't even really invented until about the end of the 1st century CE. And Christianity probably had a hand in on that, because in Judaism, you would have a Torah scroll. It was very expensive. It would be written out by a scribe in Hebrew. It would take months for a scribe to make the Torah scroll, very lengthy. It was written on one side and had to be rolled out, by the rabbis, etc. Someone comes up with a bright idea and cuts into strips, cuts these lengthy scrolls into strips, folds over the pieces, and then sews it up the binding, and it's called a codex. But then you can write on both the front and the back of each of the pages, and so it's economical, and also more conducive to reference. So if you're looking up a passage, let's say, or a story or a verse, it's much easier to leaf through a codex of the Gospels than it is to roll out an entire scroll and say, oh yeah, I think it's here somewhere. So Christianity not only helped to spread literacy in the first few centuries of the Common Era, but Christians may have had a hand in on inventing what becomes the prototype for books. So that's an interesting aside. Jesus is portrayed here with a halo or an aura, and that's showing that he's a divine figure, that the light is shining from within. If you remember from Buddhism, there are images of Siddhartha with this type of aura. And so, again, the main symbolism here is that the light is coming from within, an inner source, and shining out to the disciples, to the worshipers, in essence. And the halo also helps us to focus on the face of the person being depicted here. You can see that Jesus is portrayed with light skin, but very olive skin, and he's got dark hair and a dark beard. You notice though that one thing that we can point out is just a little bit of compare and contrast. Although Robert Powell is obviously a British actor in the film Jesus of Nazareth, in the past, the person who was in charge of casting different actors and actresses would look at the iconographic tradition, and you notice, at least facially, with the facial structure here, that there's a lot of similarity. So that may have had something to do with why Robert Powell was selected for this role. In essence, like Charlton Heston in the Moses movie, The Ten Commandments, he looks like, in a sense, Michelangelo's famous statue of Moses the lawgiver in Vatican City in Rome, and so that's very interesting. Also, detail. Sometimes these actors were picked not only for their talent, but because they would remind moviegoers in the theaters of the traditional way that these figures have been portrayed artistically. Okay, let's move along. Judaism at the time of Jesus. And the important historical thing here is you have to understand that Palestine, what would now be the modern state of Israel, the Palestinian territories, and also probably Lebanon, a little bit of Lebanon to the north. And then Syria, even more north, and Asia Minor, which would now be Turkey. But Judea, the region of Judea, from which we get the term Jew, or Judeos, right? Judahite, literally. They were a people under occupation, and the Roman Empire was expanding rapidly in the first century BCE and into the first couple of centuries CE, into the Christian era. So Rome was expanding northward into what would now be Germany and France. It had already taken the North African coast and Spain, and it was advancing east. So this was all considered occupied territory, the province of Judea, with the holy city of Jerusalem for the Jews. This was taken under Roman control in the year 63 BCE. So roughly about 60 years before the time Jesus is born, the Jews are occupied, the Palestinian Jews, and their city of Jerusalem is ruled by a governor appointed directly and serving directly under the emperor in Rome. Judaism is a tolerated religion by the Romans. Religia licita. It literally means a licit religion, a legal religion. And so Rome was interested in a couple of things. They would tolerate you to worship your god or gods as long as you were loyal to Rome and you paid your taxes, and you didn't defame the emperor. Later, the emperors come to be seen as almost divine figures or semi-divine figures. That the ball starts rolling with Augustus Caesar, who's the Caesar at the time that Jesus is born, and sort of increases over the centuries to the point where the emperor is almost considered a son of the gods, right? Divine himself. Many times it wouldn't be seen as seemly for the emperor to proclaim himself divine while he was living. Emperor Nero changes that a bit, and he had issues, and some people thought that he was unsound, but he begins a process where in the mid first century CE into the second century CE that the emperors are beginning to deify themselves in a sense, not just after their passing, but while they're still alive, and demanding reverence and respect. And so Jews, as fierce monotheists, would obviously take issue, many Jews, with lending semi-divine status to the emperor in Rome, even though they were occupied. Okay, so you understand the Roman context here, that Jesus is a Jew born in the Galilean region, and he's born into a world where Jews are second-class citizens in their own territory, in their own land. And there were many persecutions, especially if there were violent uprisings by Jewish zealots or revolutionaries. Many times the Romans would crucify or execute these revolutionary movements. So Jesus is definitely born into a time and a place where his people understand oppression and occupation, and hence they're looking for a Jewish Messiah, a deliverer, a king who will come and free them and free Jerusalem and sit on the throne of his ancestor David. I'm giving you some of the various groupings. The one thing to understand about the context of Jesus is that Judaism, like other religions, is not a monolithic religion. There were different groups, different levels of adherence, and I list some of those that are mentioned here in the Christian Gospels and the Christian New Testament. With the exception of the last group, the Essenes, who were sort of an isolated monastic community that lived out by the Dead Sea at the Qumran settlement. And they were a messianic group, but they really don't have any contact with early Christians. There is some speculation that John the Baptist may have stayed for a while at the Qumran monastery, or at least been influenced by the teachings of the Qumran community, the community of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and that's interesting. But Jesus most likely did not venture out to this community. He's more comfortable in an urban environment. John is more of a desert dweller, a monastic, a celibate. Jesus draws his disciples from the fishermen and the working classes of the towns around the Sea of Galilee in the north. He does make pilgrimage to Jerusalem with his family during the Passover feast and some of the other festivals. but he sees himself more with the folks, with the working classes um, in 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 the Galilee region, and that really comes out in his parables, his stories. His parables talk about farmers and fishermen and tax collectors, etc., the rough and tumble folks in the region that he's from. So this gives you some ideas. The Sadducees or the Zadokites, the Hebrew term, it means righteous one. And these were the priestly caste in charge of the temple in Jerusalem. They're interesting in the sense that they accept the Torah as binding, the law of Moses. They did not believe in a bodily resurrection, and so I give you a couple of citations here where Jesus and later the apostles get into arguments with the Sadducees over this idea of resurrection. The Pharisees were specialists in the law of Moses. They would be like the equivalent of a Qadi in Islam. In other words, somebody who's trained as a religious scholar, and you would go to almost as like a lawyer. You would seek advice. How can I be an observant Jew? What should I do in this given situation? And so they served a needful role in contemporary Jewish society. These were the legal specialists. They believed in a bodily resurrection, and they accepted the later prophetic books in the Hebrew Bible or the Hebrew canon outside of the Torah, although they were specialized in interpretation of Torah. Jesus doesn't he doesn't argue with them so much about afterlife, etc., but he argues with them about compassion and mercy. And he says there's more to simply adhering to the law of Moses, and you have to have compassion and mercy. And that ultimately, from Jesus's perspective at least, the way he's portrayed in the Christian Gospels, the point of religion is not to perfect the items of the law or the adherence of the law, even though that's important. But all of that would lead to the heart of God or the heart of mercy. And so Jesus is quoting from some of the Hebrew prophets and saying God desires not a sacrifice but mercy. He desires mercy and not a sacrifice. So he gets into some issues with the Pharisees. This group were the precursors to rabbinic Judaism, and so the concept of the rabbi as the teacher, the master, that you would go to as a Jew, as an observant Jew, and you would ask your questions and say, what does Moses mean when he says this, etc. And the Pharisee would be the person in the community that you would trust with advice, etc. The Hellenists were simply Greek-speaking Jews, and those who adopted the Hellenistic, the Greek and Roman customs. It's interesting that some of the earlier disciples of the apostles were from this crew here, and that's mentioned specifically in the book of the Acts of the Apostles. We know that there was conflict in the early Christian community between Palestinian Jews that were more Hebraic in their observance and their language and their emphasis, and Hellenistic Jews that dressed more like the Romans and could read Greek possibly and read their Plato and their Aristotle alongside a Greek translation of the Torah and the scriptures. So at time the Hellenists get a bad rap, and they're seen as sellouts. In other words, the ones that are saying, hey, there's something to benefit from here. Maybe civilization, Roman civilization, is not such a bad thing if we pay our taxes. We get some stuff from it. We get Roman roads, we get shipping and trade, and we get Greek philosophy and culture, etc. So maybe they're kind of like the best of both possible worlds. Let's see if we can just agree to get along here. The Zealots are your Malcolm X's. They're your revolutionaries, and by any means necessary, they were the committed to overthrowing the Roman authority. And this is an interesting group because we know that they were suppressed throughout the 1st and 2nd century CE. One of Jesus's chosen 12 disciples in the Gospels is Simon the Zealot, and he's clearly identified as a zealot, as a revolutionary. There's some speculation as to whether or not Judas Iscariot was ever a zealot or influenced somewhat by their teaching. There's no real motive given in the Gospels apart from greed and the 30 pieces of silver. But there's no real motive given as to why Judas betrayed his master, his rabbi, Jesus, after the Last Supper and sold him out to the palace guard, precipitating his arrest and crucifixion by the Romans. But if Judas was influenced by zealots or the zealot teaching that the Mashiach, the anointed king to come, would lead the revolution, the Jewish-Palestinian revolution against Rome, and free the Jews from Roman occupation, then it is interesting as a speculation that maybe Judas himself did perceive Jesus as a Messiah and therefore tried to precipitate events so that he could kick off the revolution, so to speak. From the Gospels, from the perspective of the Gospel writers, Jesus says all sorts of enigmatic things like, my kingdom is not of this world. He tells the governor, the Roman governor, in the Gospel of John, he says, if my kingdom were of this world, my followers would fight you, but since my kingdom is not from this world, they're not going to do that, essentially. So Judas is a tragic figure in the Gospels, and he realizes that he's betrayed innocent blood, and he goes out and hangs himself, commits suicide. So it is interesting as a speculation, although we're not provided with any motive, if he were influenced by Jewish revolutionary teaching, he may have looked at Jesus as the Christ and followed him for a long period of time closely, thinking maybe after Jesus was anointed as king of Israel that he would be his prime minister, so to speak. And when that doesn't happen, Judas then bewails his situation and goes and commits suicide because all is lost. It's very interesting. So this gives you sort of the world and religious context into the time that Jesus was born. And I'm going to go ahead and stop here